good afternoon to everyone and welcome to this sixth session of Philbio. So today we have Luca Corti with us. Luca is currently an assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Padua. Luca is mainly interested in theories of normativity and tries to decipher them in the light of classical German philosophy, especially with the work of Hegel and its modern interpretations. So this topic of interest led, among many other things, to the publication of a paper last year about Hegel's account of the animal organism and its normative implication. And today, Luca is going to explore once more the conceptual connection between organization and normativity. He will wonder why, despite the fact that organizational accounts had been recently used as tool to naturalize normativity, there has been no systematic treatment of normativity from an organizational perspective. So I'll let you talk.
Merci. Thanks. Bon, je dis quelques mots en français. Merci, Christelle Gatelui, pour l'invitation, mais surtout, je prends l'occasion, comme j'ai passé plusieurs mois ici l'année passée comme chercheur visitant, pour remercier tout le monde, en fait, Philippe pour l'invitation et voilà, la communauté de l'IHPST. J'ai passé des beaux mois productifs, sympas, et du coup, merci encore. Et voilà, je vais présenter une partie de mon projet de recherche, et c'est sur la notion d'organisation, de normativité organisationnelle. Je vais passer à l'anglais. So, in this talk, I would like to explore the topic of organizational normativity. Before entering into the details of the argument that I would like to explore, I want to talk a little bit about the context, so to get you a grasp of the picture of my interest in this topic. And then I would like to dig into the question that gives the title to my talk. So my talk is divided for this reason in three parts. So part one is the contextual one, what makes the question of organizational normativity relevant and how to situate it in a larger philosophical landscape, let's call it like that. Namely the question about natural normativity, if there is one, what it is. I will say something about it a little quick at the beginning. And then I will narrow my focus and going to talk about a specific way of looking at natural norms, which is at the core of this talk, namely the way disclosed by the theory of biological autonomy and in particular by the so-called organizational account. Despite the very notion of normativity is embedded in the idea of autonomy, there is, as far as I know, no systematic treatment of organizational normativity, and part of my interest would be to try to articulate such a view and see how it would look like. But that's not my focus today. What I'm going to do here is focusing on the existing views on the topic of organizational norms, what the organizational account says about grounding normativity. And in particular, this is point number 3, I'm interested in one argument that can be found in various places in the work of the organizational theorist that is used to connect organization and norms. It's a quite pervasive line of reasoning. It's quite simple. I will try to reconstruct it and with various interpretations and scrutinize it. And finally, we'll exert a little criticism showing that the argument, at least in the straightforward way in which it is presented so far in the literature, does not work or is not conclusive and I think requires some revision. But if we want to better account for the link between organization and normativity, and if we want to have a more convincing justification for the claim that the organizational account can naturalize norms or can capture normativity in nature. So this is the roadmap. So first I'm going to talk about general normativity in general, organizational account, and then this counterfactual argument. So before entering into the argument, a little bit of context, general context, maybe too general for those of you who have the fine taste, but I hope I will put some questions on the table, general, so that we can discuss them in the Q&A, okay? And situate this problem into a larger debate. So the larger debate and the topic is, of course, the topic about normativity. It's my interest. It's an ubiquitous topic. As you probably know, in contemporary philosophy, it gets discussed in a lot of different areas. philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, meta-ethics, all these areas have ongoing debates on norms, and there are a variety of questions that are investigating about this topic, some empirical, some more conceptual, very different from each other. All sorts of philosophers, and not only philosophers, discuss around normativity to the point that already, 2008, Jerry Fodor summarized the current situation with a joke. Everybody goes on about norms, cows go moo, philosopher go norm, right? Fodor was not really fond of this debate, but 12 years later, the discussion is still there, and it's not going any better. The literature on normativity is growing. One of the issues that gets most discussed in this context is a version of a very classical problem, if you want, and concerns the place of normativity in nature and the relation between normativity and natural scientific theorizing. The overarching form of this problem can be framed using a label that has been coined by Hugh Price, and who has given a particular successful shape to this question, and it's the placement problem, easy problem. Can we fit normative objects, properties, facts into our descriptions of nature? And as you know, simple point, the problematic nature of the placement problem stems from the assumption that if we identify nature with the object of natural scientific theorizing, and then if we accept the second premise that natural sciences do not, at least according to common view, use normative vocabulary, well, that does mean that nature does not have place for norms. So normative properties should not be contained in our ontology of nature. Price makes further distinction. I'm going to not go into them. That's not my interest. I just want to frame the general point. But according to this view, the very idea of natural normativity becomes problematic, if not an oxymoron, because there is no room for norms in nature. But if we deny the idea of natural normativity, the placement problem becomes even more urgent, because we can end up in two different positions. So you risk to be forced in one of these two different positions. Again, very simplistic if you want. You have to deny that norms are natural, so you embrace a non-naturalistic account of norm. Maybe you want to say the norms are social in nature. So if you want to visualize this using a common distinction that is made between the realm of norms and the realm of laws, so the realm of norms and the realm of natural scientific explanations. You want to be non-naturalistic, but the risk that you have there is the dualism. Or you can be a reductivist, right? So you can say, well, we could at some point in some ideal future framework for physics reduce norm to nature, but then the very phenomenon of normativity disappears, if you want, from your ontology. Thus, there are two possible strategies that run this risk. Of course, there are various ways to face the problem. You could bite the bullet and be reductivist, or you could enlarge the notion of your notion of nature, liberalize it, and then not consider natural. So consider as natural things that are not captured by natural scientific explanations. That's the strategy of liberal naturalism. But there is a way, which is the third way, which does not give up scientific naturalism, does not give up the notion of natural normativity, and focus on particular kinds of phenomena to locate the phenomena of normativity in nature. And those are not physical phenomena, but biological ones. So there is this general idea that normativity is a phenomenon that can be addressed in a way by research in the biological domain. So there are forms of normativity exhibited by certain sorts of being, mostly living beings. So often perspectives from biology have been mobilized as a means for naturalizing norms. And it's not a coincidence, the question of normative vocabulary is a traditional question for the philosophy of biology. There is one strand in the debate on the philosophy of function, that is the strand on the normativity of function. So I think it's interesting in looking at this larger set of debates of norms, and it's with this issue in mind that I would like to approach the problem of natural normativity, and it was this issue that I came to be interested in the question that I want to address in this talk, namely the justification of normative ascriptions to particular kinds of being, namely organized beings. Okay. And I'm going to explore what a particular account has to say about this question. The account I want to focus on is the so-called organizational account. I think most of you are familiar with this view, in part because they have been developed here. So this is the part of the talk where I'm going to preach communism in Cuba, probably, but the organizational account is an account in theoretical biology that emanates from the theory of autonomy and takes up and refines some intuitions coming from the theory of autopoiesis, fixes some of its conceptual tenets in order to articulate a new model for understanding some key features of life and living organisms. So it's a family of view that has been developed by various people. Some of them are in this Zoom conference in the last 20 years, maybe more. And this conceptual apparatus has been quite attractive to scholars. So it's based on key notions such as organizational closure, closure of constraints, interactive openness. I'm going to touch briefly upon them later. And many have considered this framework capable of providing a viable conceptual means to specify the basic idea of autonomy and naturalize normativity. The central intuition, again, cartoonish version of the central intuition, it's the basic organization, the basic thought of the autonomy. These organisms are autonomous entities capable of maintaining themselves and producing their own components. Starting from this intuition, the framework has been developed over the last years. So those are a few publications. And it has been used to shed light on various kinds of phenomena, so they make sense in light of organization. So the origins of life is one of them. The account of functions is the other one. Recently, Matteo and Gael have written a paper in which they claim that the phenomenon of cross-generational relations among organisms makes sense in light of organization. So the phenomenon of heredity, biological pathology can be organizationally addressed. And recently, also the phenomenon of biocentrism has been approached organizationally. Okay. In addition to these domains, one of the central questions that the organizational accounts claim to have approached and be capable of shed light on is the question of normativity. So it's one of the central tenets of the model that, premised on a particular understanding of organization, the account can ground teleology and, most importantly, normativity. They claim it gets repeated various times. Biological organization instances an intrinsic normativity. The organizational accounts provide an argument for naturalizing both teleology and normativity of functions. In particular, it adequately grounds intrinsic normativity. It provides an adequate naturalizing grounding for normativity. So that's what those are the claims. The question that I want to explore here is very simple. How does the organizational account provides justification for normative ascriptions? Okay. And more specifically, those are the two questions that I would like to focus on, okay, by looking at the literature on the organizational account. So how does the organizational account conceptually link its distinct notion of organization to normative ascriptions? So what is the argument exactly that OA uses to connect descriptive view on organization to claims regarding norms or oughts involved in organism? Okay. Quick specification here, I'm going to address the problem of ascription of normative properties that are related to correctness and incorrectness, so ought ascriptions. You know, in the debate there is this distinction in the normative domain, very general, between normativity tied to the evaluative dimension, so ascription of good and badness, and normativity tied to correctness and incorrectness, so oughts. I'm going to just to focus on the second kind of ascriptions. And so far, it seems to me, but that's the thing that I want to discuss with you, seems to me that the strategy that the organizational account uses rests on a particular kind of counterfactual argument. A particular kind of counterfactual argument in which the notion of existence and condition of existence play a central role. in that they are constitutively evoked to ground normative ascriptions for particular kind of beings, right? Namely organized ones. Okay. The line of reasoning that you can find in the literature, or that I can reconstruct from the literature, is the following one, with a little illustration made by myself. When a particular kind of organization occurs, descriptive content, then we are authorized or justified to perform an auth ascription on the basis, so an auth ascription to one of the part of this system on the basis of the fact that if the part of the system doesn't perform that particular performance within an organization, within an organized whole, well, the whole system would cease to exist. Okay. The intuition is often put in the form of this counterfactual. Contains always this counterfactual clause. Very pervasive in the literature, I think. For example, this is Matteo and Leonardo. The system must behave in a specific way, otherwise it would cease to exist. And this generates the criterion for determining what norms the system is supposed to follow. Are there similar claims? Biological organizations could not exist without the causal action of constraints. Self-maintaining system would not exist if they did not generate a causal loop between the whole configuration and its component. So, this counterfactual claim, as you see, is pervasive in the literature, and I think it gives expression to a particular intuition that is grounding the organizational account, captures something basic about autonomy. It's not used only to ground normativity, but it's also used to ground normative ascription. And this has been noticed by others before me, right? Di Paolo in 2005. Otherwise it disintegrates is the phrase that often follows in the primary literature. Right? So the argument, if I understand it correctly, has the following form. We are able to move from the description of a closed organization and justify ascription normative auths to parts of this organization on the basis of a counterfactual argument regarding the existence of particular kinds of beings, namely those who instantiate the organization. Those ascriptions are justified by the fact that otherwise the system would cease to exist, right? So, from the counterfactual. So the counterfactual reasoning justifies the normative ascriptions, but, and that's the further claim, ascriptions are objective, so observer independent. Precisely, and that's another quote, because they appeal to the very condition of existence of a living organization. Okay. So something must perform a particular task, or an item must perform a particular performance, and that's what it ought to perform. But why it ought? Why this ascription? Well, otherwise the system would cease to exist. Okay, this is the counterfactual, as I reconstructed. The question is the counterfactual a valid argument? And what makes the counterfactual a valid argument? And what I would like to claim is, it doesn't seem to be so conclusive, at least in the form that I have presented here, and that I think in the form that it's usually presented. And I think, what I would like to show or argue for is that once we look closer to the notion of condition of existence, and we spell out this core idea of condition of existence, and this idea that autonomous systems contribute to their own condition of existence, but there is nothing special in this kind of contribution that licenses and justifies normative ascription at least via the counterfactual. Okay. In order to make this visible, however, we need to look closer at the idea of condition of existence and see how it gets spelled out. This is the basic form of the argument. X ought to do epsilon based on the fact that otherwise the system would cease to exist. So you have the normative ascription and the ground for the normative ascription on the left, and the ground for the normative ascription on the right. And the question is the argument valid, and what makes it valid? We have to look into the idea of condition of existence, I was saying. It seems to me that the idea or the property that of maintaining its own condition of existence, of a system maintaining its own condition of existence, can be translated in the claim that the system is organizationally closed. Okay. So we have to turn to the notion of closure to understand what it really means to contributing to establish and maintain to its own condition of existence, right? But we will see when we turn to closure or mutual dependence among constraints, where the relations that are in play are defined in fully causal notion and in causal terms, and that might be a problem for the counterfactual, but I will get to this later. So what does it mean that the organizationally closed system contributes to establish and maintain its own condition of existence? What does it mean to be organizationally closed? Here, again, a little bit of communism. This is the basic property, closure of constraints, which is the main theoretical innovation claimed to be the main theoretical innovation of the organizational account. Closure refers to a particular kind of relation among elements in a system that play the role of constraints. Okay. The question is, what is a constraint? So to understand what is closure, we need to make a step back. So I'm going to make this step back and define the notion of constraints and the notion of dependence among constraints to understand what closure means if we want to elucidate the talk about a system maintaining its own condition of existence. Okay. What is a constraint? Well, constraints are elements of an organized system that play a specific role. Namely, they enable the occurrence of a process, exerting a causal impact on it, but they maintain a certain degree of independence with respect to the process itself during the relevant time scale. So that means that they are, according to this definition, not altered. They are conserved through the process at the scale in which the process takes place. Sometimes they are defined in terms of symmetries, but what interests me is that they have a causal efficacy, okay, constraints, particular kind, and not consumed during processes, but they enable certain kinds of processes. Now, constraints causally act on processes, and sometimes they causally act on processes that lead to the production of other constraints, okay? That means that constraints can depend on each other, okay? Not only, constraints can depend on each other in such a way that a production of one constraint leads to a series of dependencies that in the end contributes to the production of the very same constraint, okay? And this is closure. So this is the idea of closure. You can see, this is an illustration from a paper by Matteo. And you can see the constraints number 3 acting on a process A3, producing constraint number 2. Constraint number 2 acts on a process A2, produces constraint number 4. Constraint number 4 up again works on a process A4 and produces constraint number 3, producing a closure of constraints. So, okay. So constraints are not only causally efficacious, but they depend on each other in the notion of closure. Okay. This is again, I think, closure 101. Okay. Here I want to pause for a second and stress a couple of things that might be relevant for the question of the counterfactual. Okay, this is the definition of closure, which is like what I've just said. And focus a little bit on the notion of dependence, just emphasizing the fact that dependence among constraints is fully defined in causal terms. So constraints act on processes enabling certain, enable processes to happen. They are causally efficacious. But also the notion of dependence, thus understood, specifies the idea of enabling conditions. When within the framework, when we talk about enabling conditions, there are constraints that enable the maintenance of other constraints. So something gets lost. And this idea of dependence, I think, sheds light also on the notion of condition of existence that we were talking about a little bit before. Because when we say that constraints are the condition of existence for other constraints, what we are saying is simply that constraints causally enable the production of other constraints. So the conclusion, or the thing that I would like to focus on or keep in mind, is that the talk of condition of existence is a way of talking about causal relation of dependence among constraints, so that are so structured, so related that, quote, the whole web is collectively self-maintaining. End of the quote. So now we have a better handle of what it means to talk about systems providing their own condition of existence, and the idea of what it means being organizationally closed. That means instantiating a particular causal regime. And we can go back to the counterfactual argument, right? To the idea that normative ascriptions are justified by the fact that if a part does not perform a particular task, the system would cease to exist. So now we know what a system is, what it does mean to provide own condition of existence. And so we can ask the question in a critical way, I would say, in a different way. We can focus on dependence, which is the key for understanding the idea of condition of existence, and ask, does the notion of dependence justify normative ascription? Right? If so, what kind of normative implications can we draw from such a notion? Okay. It doesn't seem to me that it justifies directly normative ascription in the way that theorists would like to have it, right? As some sort of entailment, direct entailment, based on the counterfactual clause. Otherwise, the system chooses to exist. But to make this visible, I would like to refer to two counterexamples that you can often find in the literature. There would be two instances of application of the counterfactual argument. In first case, in the case where there is simple dependence among constraints, in the second case where there is close dependence among constraints. The first case, just the simple case, it's the water cycle, often discussed as a possible example. So let's take the water cycle and let's consider this argument. The necessary causal condition for the existence of rain is that the sun appropriately warms the body of water W. Okay. In this case, the sun can be considered as a constraint because it acts upon a process and enables a certain process to occur, namely rain. The first thing that we could say is that, therefore, if the sun does not appropriately warm the body of water W, rain that would not exist, right? Counterfactual. Okay. But then the second conclusion is, therefore, the function of the sun, what it ought to do, the ascription, is to appropriately warm the body of water, W. Okay. The argument, it's not sound. We do not find intuitively sound this argument because factual counterfactual condition of existence, so which is a correct counterfactual reasoning, are used or to ground normative ascriptions on the basis that otherwise something would not exist. Okay, so hinging on the property of what was existence admitted it's a property. Okay, so few people would be ready to draw the conclusion that the sun ought to warm the water because otherwise the rain would not exist. Okay, or otherwise a certain network of event would not happen. Okay. But we are much more ready to accept this kind of reasoning for closure, okay? And that reason is, why are we so disposed to accept that kind of reasoning for cases in which we have closed organizations, okay? But what this example shows is that causal condition of existence, if you want to use that kind of vocabulary, are neutral with respect to normative ascriptions. We cannot base normative ascription on a counterfactual argument for causal condition of existence. So it's difficult to see what in the notion of condition of existence so spelled out as the dependence would license this step. Okay. But then you can say, well, of course, but that's not the organizational account. That's not what they're saying here. We need closure to make normative ascriptions. That's a different thing. Okay. So how do things look like when we have closure? My impression, but that's something I would like to discuss with you, is that although the presence of closure marks a difference at the descriptive level, okay, of the premise and makes the counterfactual much more complicated, there does not seem to be a relevant difference at the level of the justification of the normative implication via the counterfactual. Okay. The descriptive content of the premises looks a bit complex, but the form of the argument is the same, and so the conclusion is not warranted, I think. So in the case of closure, the argument should I think, might take the following form. Premise 1, the necessary causal condition for the existence of C2 is that C3 appropriately enables a process to occur in a way that generates C2. The necessary causal condition for the existence of C3 is in turn that C2 appropriately enables a process A to occur, eventually via a chain of dependencies. I've not included all of them. Well, that produces again C3. Therefore, conclusion, if one of the constraints that does not appropriately enable the process, well, the other constraints would not exist, and vice versa. Okay. Now, it seems to me that the conceptual point raised above regarding the impossibility to transition from a causal concept of dependence to a normative concept of norm by appealing to the notion of existence seems unaffected. The fact that the dependence among constraints is internal does not alter the situation. We are still taking an argument mentioning a list of factual causal conditions for X as ipso facto underwriting normative ascriptions regarding those conditions, based on the idea that the system would just exist. And I think this is the critical point about the scope of the counterfactual argument. And this is independent from the fact that the dependence among constraints is internal or external. So if we have the water cycle or enzymes generating a closed network, there is no principal difference with respect to those two cases if you want to use a counterfactual argument based on the claim that otherwise the system would cease to exist, right? No principle. So, and I'm going to close. So the conclusion seemed not warranted, although the counterfactual, like in the previous case, is warranted. So if we don't have a certain kind of causal dependence, the system doesn't exist, but rain doesn't exist either, and none of the two ought to perform anything that does not license ascription or normativity. Okay. So it seems the conclusion that, well, we are tempted to draw the conclusion that once we have spelled out the talk of condition of existence and the talk of a system providing its own condition of existence, so appealing to the fact that these conditions are internal does not seem sufficient to perform the justificatory work assigned to it. There's nothing special in closure that enables normative ascriptions, right? And this is, yeah, the conclusion. So appealing to the counterfactual, but specifying that conditions are internal, since they are simply so causally defined by the notion of dependence, is not sufficient to perform the justificatory work assigned to it, right? This is problematic, and this seems to be put a little bit of pressure on the classical strategy or the claims that you can find in the literature that the organizational account is able to naturalize normativity and justify normative ascriptions. If this is the argument that we are relying to in order to perform this justification. Before closing, so yeah, I want to make a couple of remarks and then discuss this problem with you. One might ask, why is this intuition so strong? So what make it so convincing at the beginning that we ought, yeah, to ascribe certain normative properties to closed organized being, otherwise they would cease to exist. Okay. Well, one intuition is about the normative value of organizational existence. So we tend to find living stuff more valuable than non-living stuff. Okay. And we can claim that the existence of organizationally closed systems has a value built into itself, right? Some theorists are willing to go that way. Peter McLaughlin and more recently Parisa Mousavi are arguing for that. But this is an additional premise, okay? You could argue for it, and in that case it would be easier to ascribe normative properties to organization if you say that organization should exist from the beginning. They have a value, they have goods. But this is additional premise, and as far as I know, it doesn't seem to me that the organizational theorists are willing to inject values into our theory of organization. Okay. Another element that made the idea of ascribing normativity to organized entities appealing or intuitive, I think, it's the constant use of action theoretical formulation in the organizational theories. So if you read the papers, you always find formulations like, yeah, the system must behave in a certain way in order to exist. The system maintains specific interaction. The system does X or epsilon, okay? Of course, this kind of vocabulary is the vocabulary related to agency. Its domain of application, it's not biological system, it's human actors, okay, agents. And of course, when you apply this kind of vocabulary, implicitly there are notions of normativity, intentionality, etc. involved in this kind of way of talking. If you talk about system doing is X or Y, okay. But as we have seen, the organizational account has a notion of closure and also a notion of agency that is based on a causal conception of what the dependence of a constraint is and what organization is. So everything is causal. So the vocabulary of agency, although there is this impression that it's there when you talk about the system doing there and that, when you look closer to it, it could be fully translated into vocabulary that does not have normativity. Okay? And what I wanted to argue is that when you do that kind of work of conceptual translation, well, then the counterfactual argument does not work. Okay. There was the negative point. So, sorry, I'm just talking about stuff that doesn't work. But just to recap, I started from the question, what makes biological organization normative? I took the version of this question, which is the following: what justifies ascriptions of normative properties to organized systems? Okay. Then I've looked at the basic argument, which is the counterfactual argument. Well, we have to do that, and we can do that because otherwise the system would cease to exist. I have analyzed the notion of condition of existence and maintaining its own condition of existence, and discussed various interpretations of this notion. And the conclusion that I've drawn is that the counterfactual argument, once is interpreted in light of the causal notion involved, loses its justificatory power for normative ascriptions. And so we need to refine, I think, our strategy to justify normative ascription to organized beings, since the straightforward implication from the counterfactual is not conclusive. How we can do that? Various options are open, which need to be assessed. We could go stipulational. We can reject the counterfactual or revise it. That's something that I'm not going to enter into. Maybe next time I'm going to present something of this. That's what it is. Thank you.